This is a special panel created for the purposes of making endorsement in this race. It's got people from all different departments, different faces than you saw in the spring, I believe. We might as well go around the room quickly just so you know who's who, and also so that we know who's joined you today. Again, my name is Mark. I'm the editorial page editor.
I'm Nick Lorenzo. I'm the director of Interactive.
Jennifer Sorber, commercial printing. Allison Earn, the CFO.
Joe Healy, city editor.
Prashant Chittur, president.
Tom Bubble, classified advertising director.
Joe Buck Woods, executive editor.
Okay.
Bill O'Boyle,
Okay. Okay. Now I have all your names. We're not going to surrender our group.
Jennifer Feather, the Congressman's chief of staff, and Nicole, our campaign press secretary. Hi.
Thank you. Everybody wants to talk about the economy, so I guess we'll start there. Other people will jump in with their questions. A lot of voters out there want to know what's going to happen next, what we should be doing next, but the question that we've been starting these conversations with is if you can sort of characterize for us how you would describe the economy today as of fall 2010. Where are we in this process?
Well, we're 22 months after probably the worst crash and crisis, certainly since the Great Depression. Some of us were of the opinion it would have been worse than the Great, and was worse than the Great Depression. We're in remarkably good shape today compared to where we would have anticipated being, because one, we didn't go into the free fall or the meltdown that was anticipated, and two, we basically have a very strong world economy and a very sophisticated world economy. Now, when you use terms, how are we? Probably some people would like to dwell on the negative side of where we are, but the reality, we're in a growth cycle, we're in a recovery cycle, but they're always slow, and particularly in this situation, they'll be slower than they normally are. You know, when you think about it, when we took office with the new administration, and we went back to do the rescue package, we were losing 700,000 jobs a month. It was really free fall, employment-wise. Now, if you took the government jobs out of this last return, we're about dead even in the creation of jobs and the loss of jobs in a very sophisticated economy. Is that good enough? Hell no. Are people hurting, particularly in my district? Surely they are. This is not an even economy, and that's what's probably the most disturbing thing. It's just not something where we can put people back to work easily, or even use simple Keynesian theory to apply it.
So what's the approach that you think Congress should be taking in 2011 and beyond? What are the next steps in this?
Well, I think first and foremost, you stabilize the economy as best you can. So you don't do things that are really radical. For instance, I opposed, my votes reflect that, almost all of the Bush tax cuts in the early part of 2000. I didn't do that because I hate people or I want to tax people. I did that because it was very clear to me that if we pursued the Bush tax cuts at that time, we would end up in exactly the position we're in now, with a huge deficit, as opposed to not having a deficit. You know, Bill Clinton called me about a month and a half ago one Sunday morning. We had a very nice conversation, and the sum total of the conversation was he was reminding of the fact that I participated with him in two great events in his life. One was the Budget Act of 1993, in which I corralled about 12 votes in the House in order to pass that. It was a very narrow, very close vote. The passage of the 93 Budget Act provided the impetus both in tax increases and in expenditure reduction that brought about the balanced budget and the most prosperous economy the country's really ever had in the 90s, where in fact he had a surplus for 4 years of administration. Now, what he was reminding me of was something very simple, that if we'd stayed on his course, as I wanted to do and why I voted against the Bush tax cuts, today we'd be burning the last indicia of federal government indebtedness. In other words, we'd have a zero national debt. We would have paid it off over the last 10 years. Instead of doing that, we took it from about $5 trillion at that time to now where it's $13 trillion and growing at a rate that's almost incomprehensible. What would that have done? And why did we go through such pains in the 90s and then see it absolutely eradicated? We did it because those of us that were really responsible in terms of getting the government fiscally responsible knew that if we could get the debt down, all the other problems that we have and would have in our society would be materially eradicated. Example, Social Security. You know, now we face this thing, what are we going to do to pay for Social Security over the next 75 years? Well, if we'd done away with the debt of the United States, that would have freed up $500 billion a year, half of which could have been put in Social Security, half of which could have been put in Medicare, and we'd have to raise none of those programs, encumber the American people in no way, and we'd secure Social Security, Medicare for the next century without difficulty, and still remain ourselves as the strongest, most viable government in the world. Instead, we're now, you know, supplicants to China. We have an incredibly high deficit and ever growing. Most people are starting to question the value of the dollar and our currency and our leadership in the world, all because we became fiscally irresponsible. It's not analogy. There's no analogy that you can draw in government to family life, but you know, if anybody's ever had a spendthrift in the family, you certainly know what it means. It's a very fine, narrow difference. You don't have to be very radical and extreme in order to get into financial difficulty. On the other hand, it takes a great deal of organized effort not to get there. And that's the position we were in 2000. We lost that election, nothing to cry over. It was a fair shot. Although it does prove something to me that's very applicable to this election, and that is the electorate doesn't always understand what the ramifications of an election is about. And that's our biggest fear right now, going back to where is the economy, where we're in. We're actually in a recovery stage. Most people don't realize that. The economists declare when you're in that stage, and then the people realize that 2 or 3 years later that in fact you're in recovery. There's no question about that. If you jump out 6 months, 12 months, certainly 18 months, the economy, jobs will be low down on that totem pole of important public issues, because already the seeds and the fertilizer have been put out in the field and they're growing. Not fast enough for any of us, particularly not fast enough for those of us that are facing an election 3 weeks from now, because we don't have the capacity to explain that issue.
Well, that brings up the question, do you think more stimulus might be necessary in the coming year? And if so, how do you explain that to the electorate that's already perhaps seen too much of it?
Well, you know, I just had coffee over at a coffee shop. And what little people know, one guy was complaining about the $700 billion in rescue funds spent. How do they come up with the idea of $700 billion? The total package will probably cost the people of the United States $29 billion. For $29 billion, we will have saved the most sophisticated, developed economy on Earth and all the other economies in the world that would have fallen if we hadn't put that $29 billion. That $29 billion will be recovered probably in less than a month's time when tax revenues turn around with the recovery. So, I mean, it was a very small. Well, do it in another analogy. The $29 billion represents about 3 months of spending in Iraq. So we saved the whole American economy and the world economy for the expenditures of 3 months of military forces in the battle in Iraq. If that ain't worth it, I don't know what is. Now, it's not worth it if people don't understand it, and that's the fatal error of the problem. Fatal error of Bush, fatal error of the leadership that I'm part of and the Democratic Party. We just have not explained the position of the American people. It's very complicated, but all things that are serious and important are complicated, and you have to take the time sometime to, in an effort to explain that. We just failed to do it, yes.
That being the case, let me give you the chance, because I can see tomorrow's headline, Kanjorski says economy in recovery, and people are going to read that and say, well, he doesn't know about my problem with foreclosure or this or that. Let's talk about some of those issues. And the foreclosure rate in Pennsylvania, I guess the number of foreclosures are exceeding what they were last year in Pennsylvania. What can be done there, or is it a hands-off approach?
Well, that's not something that just happened today or as a result of the economy today. That's the catch-up and the result of economic failure of 2-3 years past, actually going way before the crash. The crash was only the final indication of the problem. But the crash really started, or the economic downturn really started, probably in 07, 06. Certainly we picked it up. I picked it up in 04 in hearings. right in the Poconos. I could have told you and did tell you, or did tell other people. I'm sure I told this board in prior reviews, just that our economy was headed toward the cliff, and we weren't getting the cooperation of the Republicans when they were in power to change it, and my bill wasn't passed. I held hearings in 2004 in the Poconos, went back to Washington, and wrote a anti-predatory lending bill, and did most of the corrections for securitization of mortgages and appraisals. And it wasn't, they refused to consider it, refused to pass it. We finally did in 07 when the Democrats took power in the House. We passed it in the House, but we couldn't get it through the Senate in all that period of time, just as we couldn't until the recovery bill. And now 300 pages of the regulatory reform bill encompasses that legislation, which I put together 7 years ago.
Questions from the group on the economy, or do you want to jump to other issues?
Well, it's so exciting. I just saw the expression on our young lady's face here. You can't wait to talk more about the economy.
No, I can't. You're right. I mean, that's one thing that I research every day is in our business, just trying to get a grasp on when we're going to come out of this, because I know you say we're on the path to recovery, but the jobs, they're not there. The unemployment rate, I mean, everything I'm reading is that it's going to stay at the level it's at least for the next 6 months to a year.
Oh yes, no question about that.
And
hopefully I'm not giving indication contrary to that.
Trying to run a business such as what we have here, and trying to juggle, being able to pay people and continue to operate when you're in this type of economy is extremely difficult.
No question.
I'm just wondering, with all that we've done over the last 2 years to try to come out of this, have we done enough? And when is it going to, when are we going to see?
Well, if we go to discuss ideals, we probably haven't done enough.
Right.
Did we, in the Recovery Act, was it enough? Some of us were disposed to think we probably should have put more into the Recovery Act. But quite frankly, I voted against the first recovery program because I wasn't satisfied at how it was structured. And still I'm not satisfied the way it was structured. I think we made a gross mistake in doing short, temporary hits on little things. I think we should have taken a much larger portion in infrastructure development. But you have to do what is practically attainable and politically attainable. And the reality is we didn't get one vote from the Republican side. They had made a decision that it was more important to win the political role in Congress and ultimately in the presidency than to have a recovery in the economy. Now, I can't fault them. That's politics, and you accept politics. But unfortunately, the entire country and the entire population will pay a price for that. And quite frankly, one of the things that's very disturbing about this election, depending on how it turns out, is that it pretends that that's exactly the role for the next 2 years. No decisive action in establishing good policy for recovery, and potentially we're going to run the risk of another 2 years of absolute governmental freeze. And if that happens, I don't know where the edge is, but we're getting damn close to pushing the edge of bringing the system down.
Other questions, economy related?
Somewhat economy related. Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
It's broken. How do you fix it?
Well, I had given you the solution a little earlier.
That's what we would have.
If we'd maintain if you don't have an effective policy and expect that it's going to take you 10, 20 years to work that policy in to have its effect, and you're going to switch and change for political expediency, you're not going to correct Social Security. And ultimately, you'll exhaust all of the funding, and you'll be faced with horrendous expenses. And right now, that's where we're headed. Will we get there? No, I'm optimistic. Unfortunately, in our system, in order to build up the political dynamic to correct things, you very often have to go to stage critical. And then when it goes to critical, we form a commission, we come up with the ideas that we all know would have been the good ideas and would have worked out the system. But that really is the crux of this political campaign. To a large extent, over the goodly number of years now, the conservative part of the country have been aiming at what they wanted to accomplish in public policy but didn't want to expose their hands or talk directly to it.